fellowshipping, you know?
Right.
So we see each other around, but we don't get it. Usher, how you been, man? I've been seeing you so long.
How much did we drink?
You don't even know what's going on. You trying to say something, Usher?
I'm trying to say something.
What do you want to say?
I don't know if I should, but I'm trying. Well,
You drank that beer, you drank 2 shots of tequila.
yeah, right.
You drank
Fired up.
1 Caipirosha.
Let me say fired up. Yeah. That's your group, right? Fired up.
I like the
Fired up.
Your forehead is sweating like Uncle Leroy.
It's hot as hell.
It ain't that hot.
What's more?
The result of being around that man, Sean Puffy Combs, I don't sleep to this day. I have a problem sleeping to this day. Like, yo, man, I'm here to work, man. I ain't sang in a week. I mean, I'm 13 years old, and I'm telling him, look, you're gonna put me in the studio, man.
Savage! I'm a savage! Oh! I'm a savage! Whatever I want, I'm going to get! Whatever I want, I have to get! I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world! This is Savage Part 2! Don't tell me about shit! It's 2022 and I'm still a savage! Whatever I want, I get! Whatever I want, I fucking get!
Kick in the door, waving the 4-4. All you heard was Papa, don't hit me no more. Let's go. Kick in the door, waving the 4-4. Hey, hey, hey.
Puff and Usher did have a situation. And that situation led Usher to the hospital. Now I let Usher explain that to y'all. And he said, yo, would you send your son to Diddy camp? And Usher said, no. Ask him why he won't send him to Diddy camp.
I
don't recall.
No, because I think if a victim comes out against Usher, it'll show how egregious this shit is. Because if he can be a predator, then anybody can be a predator.
Can't smile on your face the whole time.
You feel what I'm saying? Like, people look at Usher, they don't see that. They not seeing the victim. They not seeing that boy that got rushed to the hospital. They not seeing what the intentions was in his heart when he took Justin Bieber there.
There's a famous clip of Puffy that's resurfaced with a very young Justin Bieber saying, I've got custody of Justin for 48 hours, and what we're going to do, we cannot divulge. I mean, these guys tell you who they are. They may do it with like a wink and a nod, but they're telling you, this is a bad, dangerous guy, and I knew he wasn't going to get bail.
When Usher got on Shay Shay, and I don't mean to mention other people's platforms, but he got on Shay Shay and he mentioned how great and how good Puff taught him and everything. You know what I'm saying? About the business, right? I know, and people know, that was around in that time that Puff and Usher did have a situation. And that situation led Usher to the hospital. Now I let Usher explain that to y'all. I let Usher tell that story. But how dare you say a man that groomed you, you gonna give him a pass? Bruh, you know I know. Let me reframe you on something. Remember Usher? We was at the Swiss Hotel. Puff had Kim in the room. Had one of Keith Sweat's baby mothers in the big room outside the master bedroom. He came outside in his robe. She gave him a fellatio right there. His back was turned to me. She gave him a fellatio. You knocked on the door. I came and opened the door for you. Puff went in the room. You came in the room and kissed that girl dead in her mouth. Now I'm telling that because you taking up for somebody that you know, and a lot of more people know, didn't do you right.
For years, everything the world saw was polished. The fame, the success, the carefully protected image. But behind that image, there was another world. Secret parties hidden from cameras, closed-door gatherings with restricted access, late-night events where familiar faces kept appearing, private relationships that never existed publicly, but never disappeared either. In 50 Cent's new Netflix documentary, the names Diddy and Usher keep resurfacing in the same private spaces. Not as headlines, not as accusations, as patterns, moments that were never recorded, rooms where phones weren't allowed, conversations that never left the room. This isn't about rumors. This isn't about social media. It's about what stayed hidden for years and why silence protected it. And once you start seeing how deep it goes, you'll understand why this documentary makes so many people uncomfortable. For a long time, everything looked untouchable from the outside. The music, the influence, the legacy built in public view. Names like Diddy and Usher represented success, longevity, and cultural power. And when 50 Cent entered the picture with a Netflix documentary, many expected industry history, business rivalries, and familiar stories already told 100 times before. That's not what this became. This story doesn't begin with accusations. It begins with environments, private environments, spaces where visibility didn't exist, where access was limited, and where the rules were never written down, because they didn't need to be. The documentary opens by tracing the earliest moments that made people uneasy, long before headlines or social media conversations ever formed. Adult misconduct allegations, claims of inappropriate behavior, stories that didn't happen on stages or in studios, but behind doors that stayed closed on purpose. What makes these stories unsettling isn't one dramatic moment. It's repetition, different years, different people, the same types of rooms, the same power dynamics. Accounts describe gatherings that felt professional at first, then slowly shifted, conversations that crossed lines quietly, situations where authority was present but never questioned, where discomfort wasn't explosive. It was subtle enough to be ignored, and subtle discomfort is the easiest thing to silence. The documentary doesn't rush. It lets the viewer sit inside these spaces, understand how influence changes behavior without saying a word, how access can make people hesitate, how power doesn't need to demand silence, because silence often feels like the safest option. Some people describe realizing only years later that what they experienced wasn't normal. Others describe knowing in the moment but not feeling like they had the standing to say anything, because in these environments, speaking didn't feel brave. It felt risky. Risky to careers, risky to relationships, risky to futures that depended on staying close to influence. This is where the story becomes less about individuals and more about structure. Because what's being examined isn't a single action. It's a system that allowed certain behaviors to exist without interruption, a system where private behavior rarely faced public consequence, where reputation acted as insulation, and when questions eventually surfaced, something noticeable happened. There were no detailed explanations, no clear rebuttals, just distance. Distance that didn't calm concern, it deepened it. Before going deeper into this video, make sure you like this video, subscribe our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you never miss any update. As the documentary continues, it becomes clear that silence wasn't accidental. It was familiar. Familiar enough to feel normal. Familiar enough that people learned how to navigate around it instead of through it. Phones weren't pulled out. Stories weren't repeated. Details weren't shared. Not because someone ordered it, but because everyone understood what silence protected. The film never tells the audience what to think. It documents how these environments functioned, how influence reshaped boundaries, how accountability faded quietly in rooms where no one was taking notes. And that's what makes this chapter heavy, because nothing here is resolved, nothing is concluded, but something is exposed, the shape of a system, the outline of how power and privacy intersected for years without challenge. By the end of this part, the viewer isn't left with answers. They're left with awareness. Awareness that these stories didn't survive because they were loud, but because they were protected. That silence wasn't absence. It was participation. And once you recognize the structure that allowed all of this to exist, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This was never about one moment. It was about how long something could happen quietly before anyone finally started looking closely. What comes next pulls the story into spaces that were never meant to be visible. Closed-door parties, Not the kind announced, photographed, or remembered publicly. These were controlled gatherings with restricted entry and familiar faces only, people who didn't need introductions because their presence was already understood. The documentary describes how access worked here, not through invitations you could point to, but through recognition. If you belonged, you were let in. If you didn't, you never knew the door existed. Security wasn't loud. Rules weren't posted. Nothing needed to be explained. Everyone already knew what was expected. Phones stayed out of sight. Photos weren't taken. Names weren't mentioned afterward. Not because someone demanded it, but because discretion was the price of entry. These events were designed to leave no record, no guest lists, no timestamps, no evidence that could be replayed or challenged later. Only memory. Accounts describe how the atmosphere changed the moment the doors closed. Public energy dropped away. Private behavior surfaced. Conversations shifted from guarded to familiar. What's unsettling isn't chaos. It's organization. The same faces appearing again and again. The same inner circle moving freely. The same understanding that what happened inside would never be discussed outside. The documentary doesn't claim specific acts took place at these gatherings. It focuses on intent. Why so much effort went into eliminating documentation? Why visibility was treated as a threat? Why secrecy was normalized instead of questioned? Because repetition matters. When something happens once, it feels risky. When it happens regularly, it feels routine. And when it becomes routine, it stops being examined. Some people describe feeling excited to be included at first. Others describe immediate discomfort they couldn't quite explain. But nearly all describe the same realization. These parties weren't about celebration. They were about insulation. Insulation from scrutiny, from accountability, from the outside world. The film shows how familiarity became currency here. New faces were rare. Outsiders were discouraged. If you respected the silence, you stayed. If you questioned it, you stopped being invited. No confrontation, no warnings, just absence. Over time, these closed-door gatherings became filters. They revealed who could be trusted to remain quiet and who couldn't. That's where their power lived, not in what can be proven, but in how effectively witnesses were removed. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear. These weren't accidental byproducts of fame. They were intentional spaces, built to exist outside record, outside memory, outside consequence. And once you understand that, the silence surrounding them no longer feels mysterious. It feels engineered. Because when events are designed to stay undocumented, they aren't hiding a single moment. They're protecting a pattern. As the night moved forward, the setting changed. These gatherings didn't happen when the world was still watching. They began after attention faded, after schedules ended, after normal visibility disappeared. Late-night parties, not extensions of public events, but separate worlds that only existed after hours. Locations shifted quietly. Entrances changed. On what started as something ordinary slowly transformed into something private. The documentary describes how timing was never accidental. The later it got, the fewer the witnesses. The fewer the witnesses, the less accountability existed. And everyone inside understood that. No announcements were made. No instructions were given. Phones disappeared naturally. Cameras stayed away. Documentation stopped without anyone asking. These were moments designed to exist only in memory. Accounts describe how the energy shifted once midnight passed. Conversations became looser. Boundaries felt different. The atmosphere changed in ways that were hard to explain in the moment, but impossible to forget later. What's striking is how often people describe the same feeling. Not shock, not chaos, disorientation. Time felt stretched. Hours blended together. What happened didn't feel clear enough to describe, yet it felt important enough to remember. And memory without evidence is fragile. The documentary doesn't frame these nights as reckless or uncontrolled. It frames them as intentional. After hours meant fewer expectations, fewer eyes, less risk. Because what can't be recorded can't be replayed. What can't be replayed can't be challenged. Some accounts describe leaving these gatherings unsure of how to process what they experienced, not disturbed enough to speak immediately, not confident enough to label what felt off. just unsettled. Others describe realizing years later how carefully these environments were structured, how often the same pattern repeated, different cities, different dates, the same late-night formula, and repetition matters. Because when something keeps happening without consequence, it begins to feel permitted. When it feels permitted, it stops being questioned. The film shows how these after-hours gatherings slowly became normalized inside certain circles. What once felt unusual became routine. What once raised questions became background noise. And that normalization is powerful, because once moments exist only in memory, they can be doubted, dismissed, reframed. One person's recollection can be questioned. But when many people remember the same structure, doubt becomes harder to maintain. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of specific actions during these nights. It doesn't need to. It asks why so much effort went into ensuring nothing could be proven. Why visibility always ended early? Why silence always followed? By the end of this section, one realization settles in quietly. These late-night gatherings weren't about celebration or spontaneity. They were about control of time, control of access, control of memory. Because when something exists only in memory, it can be challenged. And when enough moments are designed that way, silence stops being coincidence. It becomes design. As the story moves forward, attention turns to relationships that were never meant to exist in public view. Not friendships, not collaborations. Romantic connections, kept carefully separated from the image presented to the world. The documentary shows how certain private relationships were maintained quietly, with precision. No shared appearances, no acknowledgments, no moments allowed to exist in front of cameras. Publicly, there was distance. Privately, there was continuity. Were two realities operating at the same time. One version carefully curated for interviews, performances, and headlines. Another unfolding only in controlled spaces, behind closed doors, where public narratives didn't apply. What stands out isn't secrecy alone, it's intention. Because secrecy at this level takes effort. Planning where to meet, knowing when to appear separate, understanding what can never be said aloud. These weren't fleeting moments hidden out of fear. They were sustained connections protected by design. Accounts describe relationships that lasted years without ever being acknowledged. Others describe connections that appeared and disappeared without explanation. No beginnings, no endings, no context, just silence. And silence protected everything. The documentary doesn't label these relationships as wrong by default. It asks a different question. Why was acknowledgement impossible? Why did public image require such strict separation from private reality? Because when relationships must remain invisible at all costs, it suggests exposure carried consequences beyond discomfort. Consequences to reputation, to influence, to carefully maintain power. Public distance became part of the strategy. Appearing unconnected reduced curiosity. It kept scrutiny away. Meanwhile, private access continued without interruption. The film shows how this dual existence allowed relationships to survive even during moments of public controversy. Even when distancing would have seemed safer. Even when silence drew attention of its own. What's unsettling is how normalized this became. People inside these circles didn't question it. They adapted. They understood the rules without needing them explained. Don't ask, don't mention, don't acknowledge. Because acknowledgement creates records, and records create consequences. The documentary suggests that secrecy itself became the bond. Shared risk, shared understanding, shared silence. Not because people were told to stay quiet, but because everyone knew what would happen if they didn't. By the end of this chapter, one realization lingers. These relationships weren't hidden because they were fragile. They were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to protect, valuable enough to manage, valuable enough to keep entirely outside the public truth. And when romantic connections can exist for years without ever being acknowledged, it raises a deeper question. Not about who was involved, but about the kind of system that makes honesty impossible. Because relationships don't disappear from public view by accident. They disappear when silence benefits everyone involved. As the documentary moves deeper, the tone shifts again, this time into territory that feels heavier, slower, and far more uncomfortable. Alleged relationships involving young girls, not presented as confirmed facts, not framed with graphic detail, but raised through repeated concerns that many people noticed long before they ever spoke. The documentary is careful here, and deliberately so. It doesn't describe acts. It doesn't sensationalize moments. It focuses on presence. Who was there? Where they appeared? And why their presence raised quiet questions. Mabot accounts describe young individuals showing up in environments clearly designed for adults. Late-night settings, private gatherings, spaces defined by power, experience, and influence. Nothing about it was openly challenged at the time. Nothing was announced as inappropriate. But discomfort lingered. Age concerns surfaced in indirect ways, through glances, through hesitation, through conversations that stopped mid-sentence. People noticed, but didn't know how to respond. The documentary shows how these moments were rarely discussed openly, not because they weren't seen, but because acknowledging them felt dangerous. In spaces controlled by influence, questioning the environment itself can feel like crossing an invisible line. Some accounts describe feeling confused rather than alarmed. Others describe recognizing the imbalance immediately, but choosing silence over confrontation, because silence felt safer. Safer for careers, safer for access, safer for survival inside powerful circles. What makes these accounts unsettling is their similarity. Different people, different years, different locations, the same uneasy reaction, the same internal question. Why is this happening here? The documentary does not claim answers. It doesn't attempt to resolve the discomfort. Instead, it examines how easily concern can be normalized when authority goes unchallenged. When age gaps exist alongside power, influence shapes perception. It blurs boundaries. It makes people second-guess their instincts. Was it inappropriate? Or was it just not their place to question? That uncertainty is where silence grows. The film shows how these environments lack clarity. No one explained why certain people were present. No one addressed the imbalance directly. Responsibility was blurred, spread thin enough that no one felt obligated to speak. And when responsibility is unclear, accountability disappears. Some accounts describe realizing years later how abnormal those moments truly were. At the time, they were brushed aside, rationalized, forgotten, until they weren't. Because when similar stories surfaced again and again, discomfort stopped feeling isolated. It started feeling patterned. The documentary doesn't ask viewers to judge. It asks them to notice. To notice how vulnerability can exist without overt harm being proven. To notice how imbalance alone can create risk. To notice how power can make questioning feel impossible. By the end of this section, the weight isn't created by what's shown. It's created by what was never addressed. If everything was appropriate, why did so many people feel uneasy? And if nothing was wrong, why were those concerns never acknowledged openly? Because some questions don't disappear when they're ignored. They wait, and when they resurface years later, they carry more weight than they ever did in the moment. Not because they were proven, but because they were never answered. As the documentary continues, it shifts toward another layer of secrecy, one guarded with exceptional care. Alleged relationships with men, not presented as scandal, not framed as wrongdoing, but examined through the lens of concealment. The focus here isn't identity itself, it's separation. The separation between public persona and private reality. Accounts describe how image management operated with precision. Public appearances were controlled, narratives were consistent, associations were filtered carefully so that nothing conflicted with the brand presented to the world. Behind closed doors, the rules were different. The documentary suggests that privacy here wasn't casual, it was strategic. Maintained not for comfort, but for protection, protection of influence, protection of reputation, protection of a carefully constructed image that could not afford contradiction. Some accounts describe private connections that were never acknowledged and never denied. Relationships that existed only in spaces where cameras were absent and phones were unwelcome. Where silence wasn't requested, it was assumed. What stands out is the effort involved. Different locations, different timings, different circles. Public life and private life never overlapping. The film doesn't speculate on labels or motivations. It doesn't define anyone. Instead, it asks why secrecy had to be absolute, why exposure was treated as a risk, why acknowledgement was impossible, why denial was unnecessary. Because when something must be hidden this carefully, the secrecy itself becomes the story. Accounts describe how trust functioned in these environments. Who could be present? Who could be relied upon to stay quiet? Who understood the unspoken rules without explanation? Breaking those rules didn't result in confrontation. It resulted in disappearance. Invitations stopped. Access faded. Connections were quietly severed. Not as punishment, but as prevention. The documentary highlights how maintaining this separation required coordination over years. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't spontaneous. It was sustained through shared understanding and mutual risk. And mutual risk creates silence. Not because people don't know, but because they do. The film makes a clear distinction here. Privacy is a right, but secrecy at this scale serves a purpose. When enormous effort is spent ensuring something never becomes visible, it raises questions, not about personal truth, but about consequence. What would change if it became known? Who would lose power? And why was that loss unacceptable? By the end of this section, a quiet realization settles in. This wasn't about hiding a personal detail. It was about preserving a public narrative so carefully constructed that it could not survive scrutiny. And when maintaining an image requires this level of control, this much silence, this much coordination, it stops being personal. It becomes structural. Because systems built on secrecy don't just hide parts of the truth. They reshape reality around it. So no one ever asked why it had to be hidden in the first place. As the documentary unfolds further, attention shifts to relationships that carried an entirely different level of weight. Not private connections with unknown figures, but secret relationships with celebrities. Powerful names, recognizable faces, people whose public images were carefully managed and fiercely protected. The film shows how Diddy, Usher, and other influential figures appeared separate in public. Different interviews, different narratives, different lanes that suggested distance. But privately, that distance didn't exist. Accounts describe the same powerful names moving together in spaces never meant for cameras. Private gatherings, restricted environments, in our after-hours settings where access was limited and familiarity was unquestioned. What's striking isn't that celebrities crossed paths. That's expected. It's how deliberately invisible those connections were kept. No shared photos, no casual mentions, no acknowledgement of proximity. Public separation became part of the strategy because distance lowers scrutiny, and scrutiny is dangerous when influence overlaps. The documentary suggests these relationships weren't accidental or fleeting. They were consistent. The same people appearing across different locations, different years, under different circumstances, always privately, never publicly. Timelines began to align in subtle ways. Movements overlapped. Presence repeated. Not enough to make accusations, enough to challenge coincidence. Some accounts describe seeing the same familiar faces in private settings despite public claims of separation. Others describe how certain individuals always seemed to have access when others didn't. No introductions were necessary, no permissions required, they already belonged. This is where power compounds, because when influential people share private spaces, silence becomes mutual, not enforced. Understood. No one benefits from breaking it. Reputation is at stake. Opportunity is at stake. Access is at stake. The documentary doesn't claim conspiracy. It doesn't assign intent. It shows how protection works when influence overlaps. Publicly, everyone appears independent. Privately, familiarity remains intact. And that duality matters, because when powerful figures protect each other's privacy, accountability becomes scattered. Questions lose direction. Scrutiny weakens. Who do you question when no one claims closeness? Who do you hold responsible when association is never acknowledged? That ambiguity becomes armor. The film lingers on how public disagreements sometimes felt performative. Enough distance to satisfy appearances. Enough familiarity to preserve trust. Not conflict, calculation. By the end of this section, one realization settles in quietly. Power doesn't move alone. It moves in networks, quiet networks, flexible networks, networks that know when to be visible and when to disappear. And when Diddy, Usher, and other powerful names keep appearing together where no one is watching, it stops feeling random. It starts to feel intentional, not to create noise, but to avoid it. Because in a world built on image, nothing is more valuable than silence shared among the powerful. As the documentary moves deeper, it circles back to the claims that first unsettled so many people. Adult misconduct allegations, claims of inappropriate behavior, disturbing stories said to have happened behind closed doors. The film is careful here. It does not present verdicts. It does not declare guilt. Instead, it documents how these stories emerged and why they never fully disappeared. What connects these accounts isn't spectacle, it's similarity. Different people, different timelines, the same kinds of private environments, rooms without witnesses, moments without records, situations where authority outweighed consent in subtle, unspoken ways. Accounts describe professional settings that slowly shifted into something else, boundaries that blurred quietly, situations where discomfort wasn't dramatic enough to stop everything, but persistent enough to be remembered years later. And that persistence matters, because these stories didn't happen in public. They weren't caught on camera. They unfolded where privacy removed accountability. The documentary avoids graphic detail. It focuses on atmosphere. Moments where people describe feeling unsure, situations where saying no didn't feel simple, environments where power made hesitation feel like compliance. What stands out is how often people describe doubting themselves at the time, convincing themselves they were overreacting, laughing things off, choosing silence over confrontation. Not because nothing felt wrong, but because speaking felt risky. Risky to careers, risky to access, risky to futures shaped by proximity to influence. The film shows how power functioned quietly in these moments, not through force but through implication. The power to invite, the power to exclude, the power to shape opportunity with a single decision. In those spaces, authority didn't need to announce itself. It was already understood. Some accounts describe only realizing years later how inappropriate certain dynamics may have been. With distance came clarity. With time came perspective. And when multiple people reached similar realizations independently, the stories stopped feeling isolated. They began to feel patterned. The documentary doesn't claim every allegation is true. It doesn't assign blame. It asks why these stories were never addressed openly, why explanations never followed, why distance replaced clarity. Because silence in situations like this, it doesn't neutralize concern. It preserves it long enough for memory to sharpen, for patterns to become visible, for questions to grow heavier instead of fading. The film highlights how private spaces can normalize behavior that would never survive public scrutiny, how repetition turns discomfort into routine, how routine slowly erases the instinct to question. And that erosion is dangerous, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it allows environments to exist without challenge. By the end of this section, the weight doesn't come from a single story. It comes from accumulation, from how many people describe the same unease, from how often the same settings appear, from how consistently silence followed. Because unease doesn't appear without cause. It grows in places where boundaries aren't clear, in where power goes unchecked, where what happens behind closed doors is protected by design. And once those doors begin to open, even slightly, the focus shifts, not just to what may have happened, but to how long the system surrounding it was allowed to remain untouched. As the documentary continues, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Some accusations never disappear. They don't explode into court cases. They don't arrive with documents or verdicts. They don't dominate headlines for weeks and then fade. They linger, unverified, yes, but persistent. The film traces how these claims surface quietly again and again across different moments in time. Careers evolved. Public narratives shifted. Images were refined. Yet the same questions kept returning, unchanged. What's unsettling isn't how loud these accusations were, or it's how durable they proved to be. False stories usually collapse. They lose energy. They fade when attention moves on. These didn't. They resurfaced in conversations behind the scenes, in warnings passed privately, in things people said carefully, without ever putting them on record. And that consistency matters. Different voices described similar dynamics. Different years reflected the same concerns. Different environments produced the same unease. Not identical stories, but familiar shapes. Private settings, limited witnesses, power imbalance, and afterward, silence. After part 1 of the documentary was released, many expected resolution, clear denials, direct explanations, something that addressed the patterns head-on. What followed instead was nothing. No detailed responses, no clarification, no attempt to dismantle the structure of the claims, just distance. And distance doesn't erase questions, it amplifies them. The documentary shows how unanswered
Jaguar Wright and
don't
others have
vanish.
said for years
They
that Diddy had a
accumulate.
reputation for
Viewers begin
intimidation.
connecting
And in
timelines,
Usher's case,
comparing
many
accounts,
fans and insiders wonder
noticing
if
how
that
often
fear still
similar
lingers
situations
today.
were described
After all,
without ever
Usher has
being
had every
addressed
opportunity
publicly.
over the years to
And
speak
that
on what
lack of
happened.
closure
He's talked
becomes
about
its own
Diddy in
signal.
interviews,
Because
been asked about Diddy
resolution doesn't
Camp, and
require
even admitted
admission.
he wouldn't send his own
It
son into the
requires
same
engagement.
environment. But he never
Here,
fully
engagement never
opened
came.
up. And
The
some
film
say
doesn't
that's
accuse
because
silence
he
of
knows
guilt.
exactly
It
what could
examines the
happen if
effect
he
of
does.
silence.
If Diddy did
Silence
report him,
allows
or even
speculation to
threatened
grow.
to, Usher may have been
Silence
left
gives
with
space
no
for
good
patterns to be
options.
examined.
Speak up and
Silence
risk public
forces people to draw their own
humiliation, career
conclusions.
suicide, or
And when
worse,
enough people
or stay
begin
silent,
asking the
carry
same
the trauma,
questions
and try to
independently,
move forward.
those
Now,
questions
while
gain
he tried
weight.
his best to keep
And the
things hidden,
documentary
it
highlights
didn't
how
last
these
long
accusations
because
were
these things
suspended in a
always come
strange
out.
middle space.
Usher's name has now
Not
surfaced in
dismissed
court
strongly enough to
testimony
disappear,
tied to one of the
not
most
addressed thoroughly
disturbing
enough to
allegations
end.
yet against
They were
Sean
left
Diddy
unresolved.
Combs. And this time,
unresolved
it's
claims
not just
behave
about what
differently.
happened behind
They
closed
don't
doors,
demand
but
belief.
what happened in
They
plain
demand
sight.
attention.
According to a
They wait
report
for
by People
context.
magazine,
They
former
wait for
Danity Kane
comparison.
singer Dawn
They wait
Richard
for the
took the
moment when
stand and
enough
delivered
similar stories
powerful
exist
testimony,
that
alleging that
coincidence
she
becomes harder
witnessed
to defend. By the end of this section, the viewer isn't handed proof. They're handed a realization that the most damaging allegations aren't always the ones shouted the loudest. They're the ones that survive time, the ones that keep the same shape across decades, the ones that remain unanswered no matter how many opportunities there were to explain them. Why? Because when questions are given silence instead of answers, they don't disappear, they settle. And once they've settled long enough, the story changes. It stops being about whether something can be proven. It becomes about why so many chances to explain were never taken. As these unanswered questions linger, the documentary begins tracing something even more complex. Hidden alliances within the industry. Not partnerships announced publicly, not friendships celebrated in interviews, but coordination that only made sense when viewed from behind the scenes. On the surface, there was separation. Different brands, different narratives, different public lanes that suggested independence. Yet privately, alignment kept appearing. The same figures showing up around the same moments. The same responses unfolding at the same time. The same silences arriving in perfect sequence. The documentary doesn't suggest secret meetings with written agendas. It suggests something quieter, understanding. An understanding of when to appear apart publicly and when to move together privately. Because in industries driven by image, distance can be useful. It lowers suspicion. It creates plausible separation. Meanwhile, coordination continues where visibility ends. Accounts describe how certain people seemed informed before information became public, how reactions felt synchronized, how distancing happened simultaneously without explanation. Not because anyone announced it, but because timing revealed it. The film focuses on behavior rather than claims. Who stayed quiet at the same moment, who avoided the same questions, who redirected attention without acknowledging why. When powerful people share interests, protection becomes shared as well. One silence reinforces another. One absence covers multiple stories. And accountability becomes fragmented. Because when everyone appears separate, no single person becomes responsible. Who do you confront when no one claims connection? Who do you question when alignment is never admitted? That fragmentation is powerful. It keeps scrutiny shallow. It keeps focus divided. It keeps systems intact. The documentary shows how public separation wasn't accidental. It was functional. It allowed private alignment to continue without attracting attention. It allowed coordination without confirmation. It allowed influence to operate quietly. Some accounts describe moments when public disagreements felt calculated rather than genuine, enough distance to satisfy appearances, enough familiarity to preserve access, not conflict, control. The film never claims conspiracy. It doesn't need to. It shows how patterns form when interests overlap. The same people benefiting from the same silences. The same networks closing ranks without ever naming themselves. And once you recognize that pattern, coincidence becomes harder to accept. By the end of this section, the realization settles in. Power rarely operates alone. It moves through networks. Quiet networks, flexible networks, networks that know when to be visible and when to disappear. And as long as those alliances remain unspoken, they remain protected. Not because no one suspects them, but because no one can point to them directly. That's the strength of private alignment. It leaves no records, no confirmations, no fingerprints, only timing, only behavior, only silence. And when silence appears in perfect coordination, it tells its own story, even if no one ever says a word. As the documentary continues, attention shifts to something quieter, but far more revealing: unspoken connections. People who were always there, yet never mentioned, never introduced, never explained. They didn't appear in headlines or interviews. They weren't credited or questioned. But in private spaces, their presence was constant. The documentary begins tracing these private inner circles, groups that didn't need names because everyone inside already knew who belonged. No invitations were visible. No roles were defined. Presence alone was enough. Accounts describe how the same individuals appeared repeatedly across different settings: closed-door gatherings, late-night environments, restricted access events, different locations, different years, the same faces, not as guests, as fixtures. That consistency matters, because access in private spaces isn't accidental. It's granted. And when certain people never needed permission, it signaled trust that went far beyond casual association. Others felt it immediately. The atmosphere changed when these individuals entered a room. Conversation softened. Behavior adjusted. People instinctively knew where they stood. No instructions were given. None were needed. This kind of influence doesn't come from titles. It comes from proximity. The documentary doesn't claim these inner circle figures controlled decisions openly. It shows how they shaped environments simply by being present. They moved freely, stayed late, crossed boundaries others wouldn't dare approach, and no one questioned it. Because questioning someone so familiar felt inappropriate. Because familiarity had replaced accountability. What's unsettling is how normalized this became. People outside the circle noticed, but learned quickly not to ask. Inside the circle, understanding was assumed. Don't name it, don't acknowledge it, just operate within it. The film suggests that these unspoken connections were the backbone of the entire system. They carried memory. They carried silence. They carried continuity from one private moment to the next. When stories surfaced, these were the people who already knew how to respond. Not through planning, but through habit. They knew what not to say. They knew when to disappear. They knew how to keep things contained. And because they were never acknowledged publicly, they were never questioned. The documentary doesn't accuse these individuals of actions. It examines their role, the role of always being there, the role of never being named, the role of making silence feel normal. By the end of this section, one realization becomes clear. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. And when the same people are always present in the most private spaces, yet never mentioned publicly, it stops looking coincidental. It looks structural, because inner circles don't need recognition to function. Their strength was never visibility, it was familiarity. And familiarity, repeated long enough, becomes authority. Silent authority, the kind that doesn't need to speak, because everyone already knows how it works. As the picture continues to take shape, when the documentary turns to relationships that existed in a careful gray space, off-record relationships, connections that were real enough to be maintained, but never official enough to be acknowledged. These weren't rumors shouted into public view. They weren't secrets hidden in panic. They were quietly sustained ties, kept alive without confirmation, protected without denial. And that distinction matters, because denial ends a conversation. Silence keeps it suspended. The film shows how certain associations followed this exact pattern. Never confirmed publicly, never denied either, just allowed to exist quietly outside the reach of documentation. People moved together privately, shared access, shared spaces. But the moment cameras appeared, those connections dissolved into distance. No explanations, no clarifications. Just separation that felt practiced. Accounts describe how these relationships were treated as understood truths within private circles. No one asked questions because questions weren't welcome. No one demanded proof because proof would have created records. And records were the one thing these relationships could not survive. What's striking is how stable these ties remained over time. Years passed, public narratives changed, careers shifted, yet the private associations stayed intact. Not visible, but consistent. The documentary suggests this wasn't accidental. Maintaining an off-record relationship requires discipline. It requires coordination. It requires agreement on one thing above all else: silence. Silence preserved access. Silence protected influence. Silence kept the system functioning. As some accounts describe how these relationships existed without labels. No definitions, no boundaries explained. That ambiguity was intentional, because undefined relationships can't be challenged. They can't be questioned directly. They can't be held accountable. If nothing is acknowledged, nothing can be disproven. The film highlights how this strategy shielded power. Publicly, there was nothing to investigate. Privately, access continued without interruption, and access, once secured, becomes more valuable than recognition. These ties weren't sustained by affection alone. They were sustained by mutual understanding, an understanding that exposure would change everything, an understanding that silence preserved stability, an understanding that speaking would introduce consequences no one wanted to face. The documentary doesn't suggest these relationships were inherently wrong. It asks why they needed this level of protection, why acknowledgement was impossible, why denial was unnecessary, why silence was always the chosen response. Because when associations live entirely off record, they don't just avoid scrutiny, they reshape reality. They allow public narratives to remain untouched. They allow private behavior to continue uninterrupted. Over time, that split becomes normal. The film lingers on a simple truth. The most powerful relationships aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that never appear on paper, never appear in photos, never appear in statements. They exist only in proximity, in access, in silence. And when something can exist for years without confirmation or denial, it isn't hiding. It's operating exactly as intended. As the documentary moves closer to its most revealing layer, it focuses on relationships that existed in a strange and deliberate in-between. Unconfirmed associations, connections that were never acknowledged publicly, yet never truly disappeared either. On record, they didn't exist. In public narratives, they were erased. But privately, they were preserved. The film shows how certain bonds were handled with precision. No shared appearances, no public history, no official acknowledgement tying these individuals together. And yet in private spaces, the connection remained intact. The same people appeared in the same rooms. The same access was granted. The same familiarity existed. Quiet, unquestioned, and continuous. What makes this unsettling is the effort involved. Erasing a relationship publicly takes intention. Maintaining it privately takes commitment. Both sides have to agree that silence is safer than truth. The documentary highlights how these associations survived across years. Careers shifted, public images evolved, narratives changed. The private bond didn't. Not because it was accidental, but because it was useful. Public distance wasn't just encouraged, it was required. Any visible closeness risked exposure. Any acknowledgement risked scrutiny. So separation became performance. Meanwhile, access continued uninterrupted. Private meetings still happened. Shared environments still existed. The relationship lived on, just invisible. Accounts describe how these bonds were treated as understood facts within inner circles. No one questioned them. No one needed confirmation. Everyone knew what could not be said. And because nothing was acknowledged, nothing could be challenged. That ambiguity became protection. If something doesn't officially exist, how do you confront it? If no one admits to it, who is responsible for explaining it? The documentary suggests that this strategy wasn't about hiding weakness. It was about protecting value. These associations supported influence. They preserved continuity. They ensured access remained stable, even as public narratives shifted. And because they were never acknowledged, they were never vulnerable. The film shows how public erasure created private security, how absence from headlines allowed presence in the most restricted rooms, how invisibility became armor. What's striking is how normal this became inside these circles. Within private environments, everyone knew. Outside them, no one could prove anything. That split reality allowed these relationships to function without consequence for years. By the end of this section, a quiet realization settles in. These bonds weren't hidden because they were fragile. They were hidden because they were valuable. Valuable enough to protect, valuable enough to preserve, valuable enough to erase publicly while nurturing privately. And when relationships require that level of control to survive, they aren't accidental. They're intentional. Not mistakes waiting to be corrected, but arrangements designed to last as long as silence holds. And silence in this system held for a very long time. As the documentary pushes forward, everything begins to center around one unavoidable force: power. Not loud power, not public authority, but quiet power, the kind that controls access inside private spaces. These environments were never equal. Who entered the room was decided before anyone arrived. Who stayed late was already understood. Who felt comfortable speaking and who didn't was determined by influence alone. The film shows how access itself became currency. Invitations weren't random. Proximity wasn't accidental. Being close to power meant opportunity, visibility, protection. And losing that access meant disappearing. Inside these private spaces, influence shaped behavior without a single word being spoken. People adjusted instinctively. Conversations softened. Boundaries shifted. No one needed to explain where authority sat. Everyone felt it. This is where significant age gap concerns begin to surface. Not as accusations, but as alarms that quietly rang and were never answered. Accounts describe younger individuals present in environments dominated by authority, experience, and influence. Late nights, private settings, rooms where power was already concentrated in the hands of a few. Nothing was officially questioned, nothing was openly challenged, but discomfort existed. People noticed the imbalance. They felt it in the atmosphere. They sensed it in the way conversations unfolded. The documentary is careful not to draw conclusions. It doesn't claim intent. It doesn't describe acts. It focuses on structure. When age gaps exist alongside unchecked influence, vulnerability doesn't need to be created. It already exists. Younger individuals didn't control the space. They didn't set the rules. They didn't decide when things started or ended. Power did. And power shaped what felt possible to say and what felt impossible to challenge. The film highlights how concerns were rarely spoken directly. They surfaced in sideways comments, in warnings without details, in advice given quietly, be careful, without explaining why. That kind of caution isn't ignorance, it's fear of consequence. Because questioning power inside private environments often meant risking everything that access provided: careers, relationships, protection. So most people chose silence, not because they agreed with what they were seeing, but because silence felt safer than disruption. Over time, that silence normalized imbalance. What once raised internal alarms became background noise. What once felt uncomfortable became routine. And routine is dangerous, because when imbalance becomes normal, accountability disappears. The documentary doesn't suggest these spaces were criminal by default. It asks why they were structured this way at all. Why environments existed where authority was unquestioned. Why clarity around boundaries was missing. Why responsibility was never clearly assigned. Because power that controls access also controls consequences. And when that power remains unchallenged for years, it doesn't just shape moments, it shapes culture. A culture where age gap concerns are noticed but not addressed, where influence overrides instinct, where alarms ring quietly and then fade. By the end of this section, the weight is undeniable. Not because something has been proven, but because too many people describe the same imbalance, the same hesitation, the same fear of speaking. And when private spaces are built around unchecked influence, the question is no longer what happened. It's how much could happen.
Jaguar Wright and
anyone
others
feeling
have
able
said
to
for
stop
years
it.
that Diddy had a
Because power
reputation
doesn't
for
need permission to
intimidation.
operate.
And in
It
Usher's
only needs
case,
silence.
many fans and
And in these
insiders wonder
spaces,
if that fear still
silence
lingers
was
today.
everywhere.
After all,
As the
Usher has had every
documentary
opportunity over
reaches
the
its
years to
final
speak
layer,
on what happened.
everything
He's
that
talked
once
about
felt
Diddy in
distant begins
interviews,
to
been
connect.
asked about Diddy
Not into a
Camp,
verdict,
and even admitted he
but
wouldn't
into
send his
pressure.
own son into the
For
same
years,
environment. But
exploitation
he never
rumors lived
fully
quietly in
opened
the
up.
background of the
And
industry.
some say that's because
Never
he knows
front-page
exactly
stories.
what could
Never
happen if he
official
does.
complaints.
If Diddy did
Just
record
whispers
him,
that
or
followed
even
certain
threatened
rooms,
to, Usher
certain
may have
nights,
been left with
certain
no good
names.
options. Speak
They
up
weren't
and
shouted.
risk public
They were passed
humiliation,
carefully.
career suicide,
Concerns
or
around
worse,
vulnerable
or stay silent.
individuals
Carry the
surfaced the
trauma
same way.
and try to move
Through
forward.
hesitation,
Now, while he tried his
through
best to
coded
keep
language,
things hidden, it
through
didn't
people
last
warning
long
each
because
other
these
without
things
ever
always
explaining
come
what
out.
they were
Usher's
warning
name
about.
has now surfaced
that
in court
matters.
testimony,
Because
tied to one of the
whispers don't
most
survive this
disturbing
long without
allegations
reason.
yet against Sean
The film
Diddy
shows
Combs.
how these
And this
concerns
time,
appeared
it's
across
not just
different
about what
eras,
happened behind
different
closed
cities,
doors, but what
different
happened in
environments,
plain
yet
sight.
carried the
According to a
same shape
report by
every
People
time.
magazine,
Private
former
spaces,
Danity Kane singer
unequal
Dawn
power,
Richard took the
limited
stand and delivered
accountability,
powerful
then
testimony,
silence.
alleging that
Not
she
one
witnessed
story repeated exactly, but the pattern did. Someone would mention discomfort years later, only to hear someone else describe the same feeling from a completely different moment in time. Different setting, same unease. That repetition is where the weight builds, because coincidence fades, patterns don't. The documentary makes it clear that these rumors were never fully investigated, not because they were proven false, but because addressing them would have meant disrupting environments that benefited too many people. Silence was easier. Silence preserved access. Silence protected careers. Silence kept systems intact. And vulnerable individuals felt that pressure the most, not because they were threatened directly, but because the cost of speaking was always understood. Power didn't need to silence anyone explicitly. Its presence was enough. When access feels conditional, silence feels like survival. The film highlights how this system rewarded those who didn't ask questions and quietly removed those who did. Not through confrontation, but through disappearance. Invitations stopped coming. Opportunities dried up. Connections faded without explanation. That's how systems protect themselves, not by denying rumors loudly, but by letting them dissolve quietly, until they didn't. Because over time, the weight of repetition began to build. Too many similar stories, too many familiar environments, or too many people realizing they weren't alone in what they noticed. And that's when silence started to strain. The documentary doesn't claim this pressure will lead to justice or exposure. It doesn't predict outcomes. It shows a shift from isolation to recognition, from whispers to shared awareness, from private discomfort to public unease. That shift is dangerous for any system built on silence, because silence only works when people believe they're alone. Once they realize they're not, the structure weakens. This is where the story truly changes, not with accusations, not with conclusions, but with visibility. The realization that patterns were allowed to repeat for years because they were never confronted together. And now that collective recognition has created pressure silence can no longer absorb. The system hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer invisible. And when a system built on silence becomes visible, it doesn't need to be attacked. It begins to crack under its own weight, not all at once, not dramatically, but inevitably, because silence can protect power for a long time, just not forever. And once enough people see the same pattern at the same time, the question stops being whether something will change. It becomes how long the system can survive now that everyone is finally looking at it together.